December 1943, Pearl Harbor. The sun burned low over the Pacific as repair docks groaned with the sounds of grinding steel, leaking valves, and the distant echo of hammering rivets. Beneath those restless waters lay the broken heart of the U.S. Navy. Crippled submarines that once hunted Japanese convoys now sat silent, unable to dive, their hulls fractured by pressure and shrapnel. Time itself had become the enemy. Every hour, a vessel remained stranded, meant convoys delayed, missions aborted, and entire Pacific offensives postponed. In those docks stood a man who refused to accept delay as destiny, Chief Petty Officer Robert Paine, a deep-sea diver whose courage often outweighed logic itself. His reputation among fellow divers was that of stubborn brilliance, a man who could fix anything, even when it defied every regulation and scientific rule known to naval engineering. Paine had watched too many submarines return from patrols scarred by depth charges and collisions, their outer plates twisted like foil. The conventional method demanded dry docking, hauling the entire submarine from the ocean, sealing its wounds with torch and hammer, then waiting days before testing again. But with dozens of damaged boats waiting and Japanese submarines prowling freely, waiting became another word for defeat. Engineers calculated that each delayed repair cost lives somewhere across the Pacific, yet no one dared attempt underwater welding. It was suicidal, they said, impossible to sustain flame and precision beneath 95 feet of seawater. Robert Paine disagreed. Kindly like, share, and subscribe to keep history's forgotten courage alive beneath the waves. That December morning, orders came through. USS Wahoo had suffered critical hull damage and risked total loss if repairs were not completed within hours. The dock commander refused to attempt an underwater fix, calling it a death sentence. But Paine volunteered without hesitation, requesting only his brass helmet, a torch prototype, and divine luck. His diving team called him insane. The engineers called him reckless. Yet Paine saw what others couldn't, that speed was survival, and innovation, however dangerous, was the only weapon left against time. As the sun dipped beyond the horizon, he prepared his descent, 95 feet down, where visibility was nothing, and sound traveled like ghosts through black pressure. The Pacific War waited above, the ocean waited below, and somewhere between those crushing depths, a single diver prepared to rewrite the limits of human endurance and redefine how ships would be saved forever. By late 1943, the Pacific War had entered a brutal equilibrium, where every vessel counted, and every mechanical failure risked collapse across thousands of miles of contested ocean. Submarines were America's silent hunters, strangling Japan's shipping arteries and delivering invisible strikes against convoys bound for the Philippines. Yet beneath the victories hid an invisible crisis that few outside Pearl Harbor ever understood. The Navy's repair yards had become overwhelmed with damaged hulls, corroded valves, and ruptured ballast systems caused by relentless deep-sea pressure and enemy depth charges detonated too close for comfort. Each submarine awaiting repair represented not just metal and manpower, but also lost weeks of reconnaissance, fewer torpedoes fired, and merchant convoys left unchallenged upon the vast Pacific horizon. The system designed to maintain these underwater predators relied entirely on surface-based operations, requiring cranes, dock facilities, and precious time that the Navy simply no longer possessed. The Admiralty's own reports admitted that if the backlog continued for another 2 months, nearly 40% of the Pacific submarine fleet would be inactive. Japanese supply convoys, once hunted with terrifying precision, began to move with renewed confidence, sensing the paralysis behind Allied lines. Every day, officers scanned repair logs filled with the same fatal notation: awaiting dock clearance, a bureaucratic sentence condemning submarines to silence. Engineers tried working around the clock, but underwater damage, especially to pressure hull seams, was beyond their reach without complete drainage and reassembly. Desperation forced experimentation, yet every attempt to weld underwater failed catastrophically, producing molten sparks extinguished instantly by seawater, leaving behind cracked joints and wasted effort. The laws of physics themselves seemed to mock the Navy's ingenuity, and yet the ocean offered no mercy. The pressure at 90 feet crushed equipment like tin, and visibility vanished beyond arm's length. Still, beneath that suffocating darkness, hope persisted among a handful of divers who believed the impossible could be conquered through sheer innovation rather than manpower. Among them, Robert Paine observed quietly, studying each failure, each burnt electrode, and each collapsed test weld until he began to see patterns others ignored. Small fractures forming not from design flaws but from impatience, from fear of experimentation under impossible pressure. In that environment of exhaustion and doubt, the Navy faced a decision more perilous than battle itself, whether to risk everything on unproven techniques or watch the Pacific's greatest advantage rust into memory. The sea demanded daring men, and soon one diver would accept its challenge and descend into history's most dangerous repair. Robert Paine was not the kind of man who waited for orders when logic failed. He was the kind who created them. Born in the industrial heart of Pennsylvania, he had grown up among steel foundries and river docks, where molten metal hissed against rainwater, forming sparks that fascinated him since childhood. By the time war consumed the Pacific, Paine had already become one of the Navy's most experienced deep-sea divers, trained to operate under conditions that few humans could physically endure. He was methodical but unorthodox, fearless but never careless, the kind of technician whose confidence bordered on defiance. When others hesitated before the unknown, he viewed risk as a language worth mastering. It was that mindset that would soon push him to challenge every established rule of naval engineering and redefine what courage meant beneath the sea. His peers called him Iron Paine, not for strength alone, but for the endurance that seemed welded into his bones. Long hours spent under crushing pressure had taught him patience, while near-death encounters with failed oxygen valves taught him humility. Yet Paine's obsession with improvement was relentless. During long nights at Pearl Harbor's repair docks, he sketched ideas for underwater sealing techniques, theorizing that flame could survive beneath water if properly shielded by compressed gases. Most dismissed his calculations as fantasy, citing both physics and common sense. But Paine's notebooks, filled with equations scrawled beside crude torch diagrams, reflected something more. A belief that the ocean's rules could be rewritten by those willing to bleed for discovery. He was no stranger to disobedience, often clashing with commanding officers who viewed experimentation as recklessness. Once reprimanded for welding a test plate at 60 feet without clearance, he merely smiled and handed the officer the finished seal, perfectly intact after 30 hours submerged. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "you prove safety by surviving it." That moment marked the beginning of a legend whispered across diver barracks from Guam to Hawaii. They said Paine could fix leaks faster than most men could surface for air, that he carried his courage inside the brass of his helmet. But what set him apart was not merely bravery, it was vision. Robert Paine understood that the Pacific War was not just fought with torpedoes or aircraft, it was fought against time itself. And while admirals strategized and politicians waited, one diver prepared to test an idea so dangerous that even success might mean death, yet failure would doom a fleet. January 1944, Pearl Harbor's submarine pier was cloaked in mist and diesel fumes, echoing with shouted orders and the grinding roar of overworked cranes. Beneath that restless dawn, the USS Wahoo, one of the Pacific Fleet's most seasoned submarines, lay immobilized by a catastrophic hull fracture suffered during her last patrol in the Philippine Sea. Her forward ballast tank had been crushed inward by depth charge pressure, and seawater leaked steadily through ruptured seams near the bow. Conventional repair required hauling her completely from the ocean, a 10-day operation the Navy could not afford. Admiral Charles Lockwood, overseeing submarine operations, described the crisis bluntly. "Every day Wahoo lies dead, another ship dies with her." In those urgent words lay the impossible order: restore the Wahoo without surfacing her, or risk losing momentum across the Pacific theater. The problem was more than mechanical, it was existential. Every functioning submarine represented both deterrence and lifeline. Intelligence reports warned that Japanese reinforcements were massing near the Carolines, preparing to strike vulnerable Allied convoys. If Wahoo remained grounded, the Navy's offensive line would fracture, leaving merchant routes unguarded and supply chains stretched thin across thousands of miles. Yet no engineer had ever successfully welded steel beneath full ocean pressure. Flames sputtered instantly when exposed to the surrounding seawater, and even prototype torches designed for shallow repairs failed beyond 20 feet. The idea of repairing at 95 feet bordered on lunacy, unless, of course, you were Robert Paine. He volunteered before the order was officially issued, stepping forward from among the dockyard crew with the calm certainty of a man who understood the price of hesitation. "I can fix her where she lies," he said, his voice quiet yet absolute. Commanders dismissed it as madness, pointing to the risk of implosion, electrocution, and suffocation, all guaranteed by the combination of pressure, voltage, and heat. But Paine persisted, explaining his untested design: a gas-shielded arc torch capable of maintaining flame stability underwater by isolating the welding zone within a high-pressure bubble. It was theory bordering on myth, conceived from months of observation and intuition rather than sanctioned science. Lockwood hesitated, weighing the Navy's desperation against one diver's conviction. Finally, with the Pacific waiting and logic exhausted, the decision was made. The order was signed. Robert Paine would attempt an underwater hull repair on USS Wahoo, a mission deemed suicidal by engineers, yet perhaps the only chance left to keep the war from slipping beneath the waves. Nightfall, January 1944, and the waters of Pearl Harbor shimmered like liquid glass above an abyss that swallowed light and sound alike. Robert Paine stood on the edge of the repair platform, encased within a 200-pound Mark V diving suit, its brass helmet gleaming beneath floodlights that painted fleeting halos across the waves. Each breath echoed like thunder inside the metal shell as his crew sealed the air hose and checked the oxygen valves one final time. Around him, mechanics whispered quiet prayers, while officers watched in tense disbelief. 95 feet below waited the broken hull of USS Wahoo, a steel giant resting silent upon the harbor floor, her damage hidden in the black silence of the sea. For Paine, this was not a mission. It was a descent into the unknown, where no diver had ever attempted to weld beneath full oceanic pressure. As the winch released, he vanished slowly into the water column, swallowed by darkness that thickened with every foot descended. The temperature dropped sharply, the weight of the ocean pressed against his chest, and the faint vibration of machinery above dissolved into a distant hum. At 60 feet, his vision blurred within the silt, his headlamp slicing narrow tunnels through suspended particles that drifted like ash. At 70, communication crackled through the radio line, engineers reading depth and pressure gauges in nervous intervals. Beyond 80 feet, even the reassuring voice from the surface began fading beneath static and gurgling interference. Still, Paine continued downward, guided by instinct, his body adapting to the rhythm of the deep, a realm where courage and calculation balanced upon a single breath. At 95 feet, the seabed emerged from shadow, and there she was, the Wahoo, looming like a wounded leviathan, her hull scarred and torn, her nameplate obscured by marine growth. Paine moved slowly toward the damage site, careful not to stir sediment clouds that could blind him completely. Every movement consumed air, every second risked decompression shock. Above, his team monitored his pulse and oxygen, knowing that a single failure in the hose or valve would mean instant death. Yet Paine's voice remained calm, measured, focused, describing each contour, each fracture, each rivet, as if painting with words what his eyes could barely see. Down there, where pressure crushed logic and silence mocked fear, Robert Paine became more than a man. He became the embodiment of defiance. Each motion of his hand beneath the sea was not just an act of repair, but a declaration that human resolve could survive where even light dared not descend. The world above waited in silence, but 95 feet below the surface, Robert Paine was preparing to attempt what science itself had called absurd. The Wahoo's ruptured hull gleamed faintly under his headlamp, each jagged line reflecting 1,000 failed attempts by others before him. He positioned his modified torch, a heavy, ungainly device forged from spare valves, copper tubing, and reinforced seals, designed to create a high-pressure gas bubble around the weld point. Inside that tiny dome of air, he would try to ignite a flame capable of reaching 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to fuse steel in an environment that smothered every spark. His breathing steadied, his pulse slowed, and the entire ocean seemed to hold still around him. It was a moment suspended between theory and faith, between destruction and discovery. He opened the valve. A hiss surged through the regulator, followed by a low vibration that pulsed along his arm. Then, impossibly, a faint orange flicker appeared inside the bubble, unstable, trembling, but alive. The torch roared softly, its flame contained within the gas shield, a small sun imprisoned under crushing pressure. Engineers at the surface listened through the radio, unable to comprehend what they were hearing. "Flame holding," Paine's voice came through, muffled but calm. "Initiating weld." That sentence, simple yet profound, marked the moment the impossible became reality. With slow, deliberate precision, he pressed the electrode against the fractured seam, molten sparks swirling within the bubble like trapped stars. Each pass of the torch fused the broken plates together, sealing leaks that had once seemed beyond human reach. Steam rose in thin ribbons, carried upward through the dark water like ghostly signals of defiance. For nearly 10 minutes, he worked continuously, adjusting gas flow, temperature, and grip, knowing that any misstep could cause an implosion or extinguish the flame instantly. His gloves scorched, his vision blurred, but he continued, guided by intuition and sheer endurance. When he finally released the trigger, silence returned. He tapped the hull twice with his wrench, his prearranged signal for completion, and began his ascent. As he rose through the dark, his voice broke the surface radio once more. "Weld sealed," he said. On the dock, disbelief turned to stunned applause. What had been dismissed as suicidal madness had become one of the greatest engineering breakthroughs of the war. Robert Paine had done it. He had lit fire beneath the sea, and in that moment, history changed forever. When Robert Paine surfaced, his diving helmet breaking through the waves beneath the cold glow of searchlights, the dockyard erupted into a stunned silence, broken only by the hiss of decompressing air. The team rushed forward, unfastening the bolts on his helmet as water poured from its seams, revealing a face pale from exhaustion, yet alive with something fierce and unspoken. He had spent just 10 minutes underwater performing a repair that previously demanded 10 full days of surface labor. The impossibility of the act rippled instantly through Pearl Harbor's command structure, disbelief meeting triumph in equal measure. Engineers crowded the pier, demanding proof that his weld had held, unable to accept that a man had rewritten the limits of mechanical endurance so completely. Beneath the harbor, the Wahoo rested motionless, her hull sealed, her ballast chambers stable, her systems once again capable of diving into the deep. Verification dives followed at dawn, confirming what Paine already knew. The seal had endured under test pressure, and the repair held flawlessly across the damaged plates. In 10 extraordinary minutes, he had reduced what had always been a logistical nightmare into a miracle of human ingenuity. The efficiency stunned every department involved in Pacific maintenance operations. By eliminating dry dock requirements, Paine's method saved not only time, but thousands of tons of fuel, materials, and man-hours, resources desperately needed elsewhere. Reports sent to Washington described the event in restrained language, but between the lines one could sense awe. Field operations successful. Underwater welding feasible under controlled atmospheric conditions. Those words quietly reshaped naval doctrine. Paine, however, seemed indifferent to the growing attention. While officers debated technical implications, he sat by the dockside drinking cold coffee, his hands trembling slightly from strain, his mind replaying each moment beneath the sea. He had not sought fame, only solutions. His thoughts lingered on the next dive, the next vessel, the next innovation that might push the limits further. To him, The true victory was not survival, but proof that determination could conquer the ocean's tyranny. That night, the Wahoo's engines thundered to life once more, echoing across the harbor like the heartbeat of resurrection. She sailed within 48 hours, resuming her patrol as though death had never touched her hull. The Pacific had gained back a weapon, but more importantly, humanity had gained a revelation. That progress often begins when one man dares to dive where reason says he should not. By sunrise, the news had traveled across the naval yards like an electric current. Commanders, engineers, and divers gathered along the dry dock railings as confirmation came through from the returning verification team. Robert Paine's underwater weld had not only held but exceeded pressure tolerances by 30%. Admiral Charles Lockwood, overseeing submarine operations, demanded an immediate report, his disbelief bordering on irritation. "You're telling me he welded through 90 feet of seawater?" he asked, scanning the report twice as though words might change under scrutiny. When his staff confirmed, Lockwood leaned back slowly, exhaling the weight of disbelief that had anchored every skeptic within the chain of command. For the first time since Pearl Harbor's devastation, something entirely new had been born, not from laboratories or committees, but from a single diver's refusal to surrender to impossibility. Technical officers swarmed the dock, inspecting Paine's torch prototype and recording gas pressure ratios, current flows, and electrode composition. The device was crude, assembled from spare compressor parts and scavenged copper tubing, but its design had succeeded where entire research divisions had failed. The realization struck every observer with equal force. The limits of underwater repair were psychological, not scientific. Within hours, naval intelligence classified the technique under restricted protocol, designating it Controlled Underwater Arc Welding, Type P. Orders followed from Washington requesting full documentation and replication at submarine bases across the Pacific and Atlantic fleets. What began as an act of individual defiance was now being transformed into military doctrine. Paine, summoned to a debriefing in the operations office, faced rows of officers whose expressions flickered between admiration and unease. "You violated procedural depth limits," one officer remarked sharply. Paine nodded, replying evenly, "Yes, sir, but it worked." The room fell silent, and even Lockwood, known for his strict discipline, allowed a rare smile to break through his otherwise steely composure. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "the Navy needs madmen to remind it what's possible." Word spread beyond Pearl Harbor, reaching naval research stations from San Diego to Fremantle. By February, underwater welding units were being trained using Paine's specifications, and repair times across the fleet dropped by nearly 60%. What had once been branded suicidal now became essential, transforming the Navy's ability to maintain offensive operations deep into Japanese-held waters. In that moment, amid disbelief and reluctant respect, Robert Paine had changed not just repair protocols, but the very definition of what courage meant beneath the sea. By the war's final year, Robert Paine's technique had evolved from a desperate gamble into a cornerstone of naval operations, adopted across every American submarine base, from Pearl Harbor to Brisbane. What began as one diver's reckless improvisation now existed as a fully sanctioned procedure, refined through military engineering and codified within classified repair manuals. Divers trained under Paine's supervision learned to manipulate the delicate balance of pressure, current, and flame stability, turning what once seemed sorcery into reproducible science. Each successful underwater weld strengthened not only ships, but also the confidence of an entire fleet that had once feared delay more than the enemy's guns. The Pacific campaign, sustained by efficiency rather than luck, moved faster, struck harder, and recovered quicker because of a single act that proved the ocean could no longer dictate terms. After the war, as nations rebuilt their shattered economies, Paine's invention transcended military application. Civil engineers adapted his gas-shielded arc technique for underwater construction, enabling bridge pylons, offshore oil rigs, and deep-sea cable joints to be assembled without surface interruption. The commercial maritime world, once dependent on cumbersome dry docks, now worked directly beneath waves, guided by principles forged during that 10-minute miracle under Pearl Harbor. Industrial journals referred to it as Paine welding, a tribute to the diver whose courage had birthed an entirely new field of engineering. Universities began including the process in naval architecture programs, teaching students that progress often emerges not from comfort, but from necessity's edge. Yet Robert Paine himself never sought recognition. When interviewed years later, he spoke with the same humility that defined his service, calling the achievement an accident made possible by fear of failure. He retired quietly from the Navy, returning to a modest life near the California coast, often seen walking along shipyards where sparks still danced against salt air. The men who had once called him reckless now called him mentor, and his students carried the craft across continents, ensuring his ingenuity would never sink into obscurity. In every submerged weld that holds a ship together, in every structure anchored to the seafloor, Paine's legacy endures, a reminder that innovation is born where courage meets consequence. Beneath the calm surface of modern oceans lies the echo of that first defiant torch, still burning in spirit, where one man proved that even the depths can be conquered by the fire of human resolve. When history measured the triumphs of the Pacific War, Robert Paine's name remained absent from official citations, yet his influence stretched invisibly through every mission that followed. His invention had transformed underwater repair from a logistical nightmare into an operational certainty, allowing submarines to return to battle faster than enemy intelligence could track their absence. Though war memorials bore the names of admirals and aces, engineers and divers like Paine carried the burden of silent victories, achieved in darkness far below the applause of nations. Every future submarine, every underwater installation, owed its resilience to that 10-minute act of desperation that rewrote the mechanics of time at sea. The United States Navy's post-war evaluations quietly declared his method the single greatest advancement in field-level maritime maintenance during the conflict, an acknowledgement as understated as the man himself. After 1945, Paine's technique was declassified and circulated through Allied navies, spreading across Britain, Canada, and eventually Japan, where engineers adapted it for post-war reconstruction. Industrial revolutions beneath the waves began to mirror the one that had reshaped factories on land. Offshore pipelines, drilling platforms, and transoceanic cables all carried a trace of his discovery. Invisible, yet indispensable, his process, refined by decades of technological progress, became the foundation for saturation diving, hyperbaric welding, and deep-sea robotics, ensuring that men no longer needed to risk their lives as he once had. Still, the principle remained unchanged, that courage could compress time, that ingenuity could defy nature, and that one man's suicidal dive could alter the tempo of an entire civilization's progress. In his final years, Paine seldom spoke of the war. He preferred quiet days by the sea, where the tide mirrored the memory of his descent into darkness. Local shipyard workers would occasionally spot him gazing at maintenance crews welding underwater through transparent domes, the modern descendants of his defiance. They never recognized the old man who had once risked implosion to repair a submarine's wounded heart, but he recognized himself in their discipline, their unspoken reverence for the ocean's danger. History's true heroes rarely stand on podiums or command parades. They exist in the narrow space between failure and creation, where decisions become legacies. Robert Paine's dive was more than survival. It was transformation, the moment humanity learned that even the sea's cold silence could be bent by fire. Beneath every wave that laps against a steel hull today lies his echo, eternal and unbroken, where courage once rewrote the impossible.